Foreign Secretary, Lord Ahmed, Lord Pickles, Ministers, my colleague diplomats, Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by saying how honored we are to have Mr. Manfred Goldberg, his wonderful wife, here with us. Thank you so much for the honor to hear your deeply moving story. We came here to hear you. I would like to thank to the Foreign Office for keeping the tradition and holding this important ceremony in such an important place. Today we remember the 6 million Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, as well as the millions of other lives who perished at the hands of the Nazi regime. We take this moment to pause and pay tribute to the millions of innocent men, women, and children who were slaughtered simply by being Jewish. These unimaginable crimes were committed by ordinary people to ordinary people. It is our responsibility to listen to the stories of the victims, to hear their words, and to ensure that they are never forgotten. Today, I think of 17-year-old Pinchas Eisner, who, like many other victims, captured his pain and suffering in a letter written to his brother, knowing that he will never see him again. On 16th of October, 1944, he wrote, "My dear brother, goodbye. Think of our talk that night. I felt as one with you. I knew that if it were you whose life would end, I would go on living as if I had lost half of my body and soul. You said that if I die, you will kill yourself. Think of what I told you, that if you stay alive, I will live on with you. I would have liked to continue my life with you and with our family. So many plans, desires, hopes were before me. I longed for the unknown. I would have liked to know, to live, to see, to do, to love, but now it is all over. In the city, Jews were exterminated from entire streets. There is no escape. Tonight, or at the latest tomorrow, it will be our turn. At 17, I have to face certain death. There is no escape." 5 days later, Pinchas was taken from his family home in Budapest to a village just outside the capital. There, on 3rd of November 1944, with 70 other Jews, he was led to a nearby forest where they were forced to dig a huge pit. They were ordered to take off their clothes and were then machine-gunned into their self-made grave. This is the story of just one ordinary boy trying to live an ordinary life, but was murdered because he was Jewish. Pinchas's letter, alongside hundreds of others written by victims of the Nazis, are kept in the archives at Yad Vashem in Israel. Chilling testimonies, forever frozen in time, that convey the lives of ordinary Jews in truly horrifying circumstances. Their words are a constant reminder to the Jewish people and to the rest of the world as why the Jewish state is a necessity. I'm proud to represent the State of Israel, a place of safety and sanctuary for Jewish people, as well as those from all faiths or for none. As a beacon of freedom, liberty, and democracy, Israel is the physical manifestation of the enduring promise of never again. The Holocaust is the greatest stain on the conscience of humanity. It shows the terrible consequences of when other ordinary people stand idly by and allow the initial roots of hatred to take hold. With fewer and fewer survivors, still able to share their first-hand accounts of the Holocaust, and with anti-Semitism on the rise once again, educating future generations about the Holocaust and the terrible consequences of intolerance has never been more important. And I know that the British government is doing so much and such a good work on this issue. We are extremely grateful to the United Kingdom for its ongoing support and friendship. Working together, we can ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust are never repeated.
Your Excellency, Ambassador of Israel, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I am deeply honoured to join you on this occasion. Last year, on a winter evening, I stood on the concrete platform of the disused Radegast train station in Łódź in Poland. From this modest and functional building, 200,000 Jewish men, women, and children were transported to Nazi death camps. I reflected on how there were countless ordinary suburban train stations like this scattered all across occupied Europe, all being used coldly and methodically for years to send human beings to be murdered. Radegast was where the Jews of Łódź ghetto were transported to Chełmno and Auschwitz-Birkenau. I stood where they stood. I saw what they saw. The crude wooden cattle trucks drawn up alongside the platform. And inside the station building, I turned over page after page of neatly typewritten names of the people who were forced at gunpoint onto those cattle trucks. One of the captives who was deported to Auschwitz, in her case from Romania, was Olga Lenya, who lost her parents, lost her husband, lost her 2 sons. And she wrote, and I quote, "Whenever I recall the first days at the camp, I still grow hot and cold with nameless terror. It was a terror that rose for no particular reason, but one that was constantly nourished by the strange occurrences whose meaning I sought in vain. At night, the glow of flames from the chimneys showed through the crevices in the walls. The shrieks of the sick or the wounded, crowded together in trucks bound for some unknown destination, grated on the nerves. Sometimes we heard revolver shots, for the SS guards used their guns freely. And above these noises came orders barked in overbearing voices. Nothing would let us forget our slavery." And then Olga asks, could such conditions really exist in Europe in the 20th century? Today, every one of us shares the solemn duty to remember that those conditions did indeed exist in Europe in the 20th century. 6 million women, children and men who might otherwise have lived in peace and happiness were consumed by the Holocaust. Now, our only possible response is to mean it, heart and soul, when we say the words, "never again." But there were, at that time, some ordinary people who meant it when they said to themselves that they would not stand by and they would not watch others being transported to their deaths. And it remains a truly extraordinary and uplifting fact that ordinary people in Denmark managed to save almost all of their country's Jews. They were hidden in churches, in hospitals, in family homes, and they were spirited to coastal towns from where they were taken to safety in Sweden on board fishing boats or kayaks or motorboats. In the town of Elsinore, the escape line was run by Erling Kea, a local bookbinder, by Tormoth Larsen, a policeman, by Ove Brun, a clerk, and by Bove Rona, the editor of the local newspaper. They called themselves the Elsinore Sewing Club, and they carried almost 700 Jews across the Sound to Sweden. They knew full well that they were risking their own lives. And indeed, in May 1944, the Nazis arrested Erling Kea after intercepting his motorboat. And he was imprisoned in the Neuengamme concentration camp, but he survived until the camp's liberation, and he lived on until his 77th year, dying in 1980. The members of the Elsinore Sewing Club and others like them across occupied Europe consciously decided to place themselves in mortal peril in order to save the lives of others. But the hard truth is that when the vital moment came, there were never enough people like them. If almost every Jew could be saved in Denmark, why not elsewhere? Today, we must all silently ask ourselves the difficult and searching question: what would I have done? Would I have taken that risk? Not just for myself, but for my whole family. And as we answer that profoundly necessary but difficult question in our own hearts, we owe it to the 6 million who were not saved to reflect, to learn, to grieve, and above all, to remember.
Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never.
Foreign Secretary, Your Excellency, Madam Ambassador, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. When eyewitness accounts of the Nazi atrocities started being circulated among Western intelligence services, the people who then worked in this building and those that worked in the American State Department didn't believe them. They thought they were battlefield rumours. In the modern vernacular, they thought they were fake news. The thought that such brutality could come from a civilized nation that produced Schiller, Goethe, and Beethoven must have seemed incredible. Even when the industrial nature of the murders became indisputable and the Allies took the decision to make this information public, That same incredulity underestimated by 50% the number of people who'd been murdered. On the day when Allied intelligence estimated 2 million Jews had been murdered, the shocking figure was actually 4 million, and 2 million more would die. Despite the unambiguous evidence that the Nazis and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jews, hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, disabled, people with political and religious dissidents. There's a whole industry out there seeking to distort and deny the truth. Conspiracy theories abound. Holocaust denial has long relied on authentic images manipulation, along with the claims of forgery or inaccuracies since well before the dawn of social media. Social media has manipulated this phenomenon. Fake news is visible in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, particularly President Putin's pledge to denazify the country. Putin's strategy has included attacking Holocaust sites, particularly buildings that hold records, to destroy Ukraine's history and its identity. The Ukraine conflict illustrates that we are not in a post-Holocaust era. As the decades progress, the number of survivors who witnessed the Holocaust as children will move from contemporary memory into history. In anticipation of this, much effort has been made to secure testimony and to protect archives. But reliance on archives is not enough and brings its own weakness. Images and audio can be manipulated. You don't need programming skills to create a deepfake. You can create it for free in less than 30 seconds using many deepfake applications. Deepfake have captured the attention of technology companies and organizations concerned in the preservation of historical truth. We are entering an era where seeing is no longer believing. The consequences of cheap, widespread fakery is likely to be profound. It is possible to imagine Holocaust survivors' testimony being manipulated. We may see Holocaust survivors with false words put into their mouths, that concentration camps were not that bad, that we had plenty of food, and that we played cards on a Thursday with the SS, and such like. Such obscenities are technically possible. The impact of deepfakes is to manipulate a zero-trust society where people cannot, or no longer bother to, distinguish truth from falsehoods. And when truth is eroded, it's easier to raise doubts about specific events. Organizations like the Shaw Foundation have put algorithms into testimony to discourage fakery. But a technical answer goes only part of the way to solve the problem. I believe the answer lies in the strength of our narrative, the truth of the Holocaust. It's inevitable that when the last witness of the Holocaust are no longer with us, history will be reassessed. We will have an opportunity to entrench the historical narrative of the Holocaust firmly in truth. So a narrative has the power to disclose the intention of people, the difficulties they encountered, and the complex world in which such historical figures actually lived. An historical narrative that gives authentic account of real-life experience. The narrative must be so widely shared and understood that deep fakes are dismissed immediately. Dismissed not by electronic wizardry, but by a clear understanding of facts and reality. We should make it our mission to ensure that those who question the basic truth of the Holocaust are seen as the charlatans and scoundrels that they are. Any civilized country will always share the incomprehensible nature of those intelligent officers 80 years ago. That there was once on earth a government that planned and executed the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, using the full resources of the state to achieve their aims. Our duty is to ensure that the Nazis and their collaborators' uniquely evil contribution to history is remembered. More than that, we owe the dead, the survivors, the refugees. We know to preserve their rights, their history, their cultural heritage, their traditions, and above all, their dignity. We must secure the truth.
My name is Afran Pervez, and I'm a Regional Ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust. I took part in the Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz online project in 2021 as a student from Elliott Hudson College in Leeds. It was online due to the pandemic, but I would tell you, it was a profound impact on me. During the project, I had the opportunity to use virtual reality technology to explore the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was amazing. And at the end of the project, I had the opportunity to share what I had learnt with my college and my local community. I was also privileged to hear from the Holocaust survivor Manfred Goldberg, BEM, who I'm delighted is here with us today, and I'll be handing over to shortly. Sadly, survivors won't be able to share their stories forever, and therefore we all have the responsibility of ensuring that these experiences live on. As Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel once said, "When you hear from a witness, you become a witness." This is why I believe it is crucial, especially for young people, to hear from survivors and to share their stories with our friends, families, local communities, and on social media, to ensure that the Holocaust is never forgotten, denied, or distorted. In his emotional testimony, Manfred spoke of the unthinkable horrors that he and his family endured, including the appalling conditions and the merciless exhaustion of the death march, which he described as a cruelty without magnitude. After hearing from Manfred, I became a witness to his testimony. Today, I hope that you will all join me to ensure that his story is never forgotten. Another part of the project that really resonated with me was a virtual reality tour of the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Although we were not able to visit the site in person, it was a fantastic resource to see what the site looks like today. The 360-degree virtual reality was also combined with voiceover testimonies from survivors, speaking about their experiences of the sites, which I found really powerful. After completing the Lessons from Auschwitz online project, I became an ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust, committed to learning more and sharing my experience with my community, joining events and meeting fellow ambassadors. I then applied and became a regional ambassador, one of around 100 young people around the country on a 3-year extended leadership program. As part of the program, in August 2022, I was privileged to go on a visit to Israel and spend time at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, Israel. On this 10-day intensive study visit, myself and my fellow regional ambassadors visited sites such as the Old City of Jerusalem and Masada, which was incredible, and heard from world-renowned experts on the Holocaust. It was an experience I will never forget. One particular moment that stood out for me was a tour of the museum and the Hall of Names. When I think of that day, I still see the shelves containing the names of innocent Jewish men, women, and children who perished during the Holocaust, and those that are still empty, whose names have not yet been recovered. The theme of Holocaust Memorial Day this year is ordinary people. For me, this theme reminds me of my experience in the Hall of Names. It encourages us to humanize the Holocaust by understanding that each and every one of those 6 million innocent Jewish men, women, and children that were murdered were human beings just like us, each with hopes and dreams like our own. It is crucial that, especially as a young person and as an ambassador for the Trust, that I continue to encourage my peers and the wider community to remember the Holocaust and these individuals. Young people often think that their voices are powerless, but the Trust has showed me otherwise, because during the project I saw a vast amount of young people from across the UK ready to raise their voice just like me. This ignited my passion, because when we raise our voices together, our cause gets louder and change happens. And on that note, I would like to thank the Embassy of Israel and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for inviting me to be here today and to have the opportunity to share my experience and reflections on why Holocaust education is so important, especially for young people. And now I am delighted to introduce Holocaust survivor Manfred Goldberg, BEM, to share his testimony with us.
Good morning. Only just. Your Excellencies, the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, Your Excellency, the Israeli Ambassador Tzipi Hotovely, Your Excellency Lord Ahmed, Your Excellency Lord Pickett, and of course to you, all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Before I present my testimony, I would like to spend a couple of moments just telling you that although I have spoken many, many times publicly over the last few decades, presenting my testimony, today's talk is for me a first. When I was asked to speak here for 15 minutes, my immediate reaction was, it's not possible to convey to you any sensible representation of my experiences, 3.5 years in a number of camps. However, I took it seriously and actually made a number of efforts. What I'm presenting to you here today is version number 6 of my talk. I kept on revising it, and I do hope I have succeeded in presenting you with a sensible resume of 3.5 years in camps representing hell on earth. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my testimony condensed into this brief number of minutes. My name, as you know, is Manfred Goldberg. I was born in Kassel in Germany. Both my parents were born in Poland. Time pressure prevents me from explaining details, but in August 1939, after my parents had lived in Germany for more than 20 years, I was born in 1930, a younger brother in 1934. My father was arrested in mid-1939, and he was sent to Poland, expelled to Poland. The Poles sent him back to Germany, the Nazis arrested him. And as I said, time pressure prevents me from going into details, but the end result was that my mother achieved the more or less impossible and managed to get a single visa for my father, entitling him to enter the UK. The Nazis insisted that he leave within 24 hours, and he finally left Germany on the 20th of August, 1939. At the time of leaving, we had had a promise from the British passport officer in Berlin that we, the family, would obtain visas within 6 to 8 weeks to follow my father to the UK. But, heartbreakingly from our point of view, 2 weeks after my father left, the Second World War began, and we, the family, were now trapped in Germany. Life was very hard for Jewish people, as you can well imagine, but we managed to get through until in December 1941, we three were, as part of a group of around 1,000 Jews, deported to Riga, the capital of Latvia. The ghetto in which we were housed had been emptied by the Nazis, massacring very nearly 30,000 Riga Jews who only 6 months earlier had been compelled to leave their homes to live in this ghetto. The ghetto was now empty, and within a matter of days, transports such as ours of Jews from Germany arrived in the ghetto, and we were housed in the same accommodation that had been occupied by the Riga Jews previously. The ghetto was repopulated with 30,000 German Jews, arriving in dozens of transports, all deported from towns in Germany. Around 90% of our guards in this first camp, this may surprise you, were Latvian Jew-hating volunteers. And I can tell you that they were just as brutal towards us as any of the SS guards. As far as I knew, all the officers were German SS. We were forced to slave labor in Nazi-run factories on a starvation diet. We had lost our names, each one had been given a number. My number was 56478. I will remember it as long as I live. We were forced to work on a starvation diet in factories many of which had been erected by Nazi industrialists on the promise that they would have unlimited supplies of slave labor. And it most likely was a very profitable proposition for them. Everything manufactured in these factories was designed to assist the Nazi war effort. We were forced to slave labor in this manner until liberation 3.5 years later. Our first selection took place in that first camp just 3 months after our arrival. Around 3,000 elderly and disabled people, in fact anyone the selecting SS officer disliked on sight, were selected and taken away to be murdered. Miraculously, both my little brother and I survived this selection. The prime reason the Nazis permitted survivors like me to live was to exploit us as slave laborers to support the Nazi war effort. If anyone was noticed to have weakened and no longer worked as diligently as the Nazis expected in return for the starvation diet they fed us, they were dragged to an execution site and thrown into a mass grave after being shot. One thing for sure, the Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews. In August 1943, we were transferred to a labor camp where everyone had to work to stay alive. I, then aged 13, slave labored, but 4 young children, including my little brother, who were too young to work, were permitted daily to remain in the camp. We deluded ourselves into believing that even these heartless, cruel, sadistic SS guards still retained the spark of humanity by permitting these children to stay alive. Sadly, the reality was that 5 weeks later, one day when we returned from our day's work, the children had disappeared, taken away to be murdered. We were sent to other camps, always slave laboring on a starvation diet. In one camp, we all had to watch 8 innocent men who were taken as hostages, being hanged in reprisal for some men having eaten some food destined for German soldiers. What's more, we were rifle-butted if we turned our heads away from this gruesome spectacle. Our transportation from camp to camp was always by cattle trucks. Sometimes there was a bucket to serve toilet needs, but never any food or drink, no matter how long the journey. People died on these journeys. Their bodies lay among us until we reached our next camp destination. Many people worked in factories, always manufacturing goods to help the Nazi war effort. But I became part of a slave labor gang repairing railway lines damaged by Allied bombing raids. The Nazis, because of very long distances, supplied their soldiers via rail, and the Allies, realizing the importance of the railway lines to the Nazi war effort, bombed busy rail junctions, which we were forced to repair. As one selection, I was spared, but my late mother was condemned to die. This selection took place by each of us in turn standing in front of an SS officer who, usually without saying a word, would point left or right, live or die. We had been in the camps long enough to understand which side was the condemned side. It was usually elderly, disabled, and sort of sick-looking people, weak-looking people who had been condemned. And my mother, unfortunately, was pointed in the direction of those condemned. I cannot go into detail because of the pressure of time, but I will tell you that she bravely managed to get across to our group, whose lives had been spared, without attracting the attention of guards, and thus she saved her life, and she was liberated together with me about 9 months later. In one camp, I was selected by an SS officer to become his personal slave. I had to do tasks like brushing his many uniforms until they gleamed spotlessly. To perfection, polish every pair of knee-length boots until they shone. Wash his breakfast things, make his bed, wash the floors of his apartment, and clean all the common parts of the building in which he lived. Many tasks all day long. I am not exaggerating when I tell you I trembled as I worked, as I was totally in his power. Had I displeased him, he could have shot me with no consequence for him, none. Jewish lives were expendable. There always were more slave laborers to replace those murdered. This daily ordeal lasted just a few weeks before we were transported to another brutal camp, the concentration camp called Stutthof. This camp had its own gas chamber and crematorium. And despite working 24 hours a day, the crematorium could not cope with burning all the bodies that accumulated. We slept 2 or 3 on each bed of a 3-tier bunk bed. Every night, people died of starvation or sickness. A team inspected each bunk bed every morning and took any bodies they found to the crematorium. Trainloads of Jews arrived periodically, and I cannot explain why some trainloads of Jews were meticulously checked into the camp and thereby condemned to a death by slow starvation, while other trainloads were collectively taken straight to the gas chamber and died within a matter of hours. In April 1945, several thousands of us, including women from an adjoining camp, were selected and accompanied by armed SS guards, we were marched out of the camp on what has become known as the Death March. We marched for hours. Anyone who, due to lack of strength, began trailing the column was mercilessly shot by our guards, and the bodies just left where they fell. We reached the harbour and we were packed into 4 ancient wooden barges. 4 tugs, manned by SS teams, towed these barges out to sea. I'm about to tell you something which you may find too gruesome to believe. Each day, an SS officer appeared and selected around 25 of us who were crowded down the bottom of this barge. He insisted that each one of these people had to be dragged on deck and on his orders had to be thrown into the sea to drown. He told us with a smirk on his face that they were using too much fuel towing us and they had to lighten the load. On day 6 of this ordeal, the tugs uncoupled themselves and disappeared, leaving our barge unguarded at sea. As we were now unguarded, a group of prisoners of war who were among us, some prisoners of war were also held in this camp of Stutthof, but they had been fed a better diet, possibly due to intervention of the International Red Cross, and they still had some bodily strength. A group of them clambered up onto deck and did something quite remarkable. They prized loose some long floorboards, formed themselves into a sort of rowing team, and began paddling, or attempting to paddle, this barge towards shore. The message came down to us that our barge was positioned only several hundred meters from shore. They could see it clearly. And they had this idea of paddling in this manner, this primitive manner, the barge towards shore. They labored until they were exhausted, and the message came down that the barge was very, very, ever so slowly responding to this effort. And as a result, when they were exhausted, other people volunteered to continue doing this. And all day long, this effort continued into the night and through most of the night until there was a jerk and we felt that the barge had run aground very close to shore. Anyone who still had an ounce of strength began clambering onto the deck, and it meant jumping into the water, which was not deep, and then wading ashore. It was a dark night, no moon. My late mother persuaded me to be brave and jump. I was then aged 15. I was taken into the camps when I was 11, and my little brother was 7. I was now just past my days after my 15th birthday. My mother and I jumped together with other people, and we waded ashore. Many of us on the barge, which numbered many hundreds, close to 1,000 of us, many of them, after 6 days, with not a drop of water or a bite to eat, were so weak and so despondent that they just remained seated on the barge, made no effort to jump as we did. We who had jumped got ashore. It was a very dark night, no moon, as I said, and there was not a single light to be seen anywhere. All we saw was a vast expanse of seashore. And while we were discussing which way might be safest to run, quite unbelievably, the SS-manned tugs returned. They, of course, were livid, and they divided into 2 groups. One group boarded the barge, and we heard a lot of shooting. Everyone who had stayed on the barge was being murdered. A second, smaller group came ashore and began rounding us up. But surprisingly, as we feared that they would shoot us as well. They did not. They formed us into a column and told us to march. Daybreak was just beginning. Again, anyone who trailed due to lack of strength, now even more so after 6 days of not a drop of food or water, as I mentioned, were shot. The rest of us kept going. After a while, remarkably, a tank column was going in the wrong direction. Military traffic passed us, going in the same direction as we marched. But this was a tank column coming towards us. And as it came closer, our SS guards, who moments earlier had still been murdering people because they couldn't keep pace with the march, suddenly turned and ran for their lives, leaving us unguarded. They had recognized this tank column as being an Allied tank column. It turned out to be a British tank column. And they ran for their lives, these SS guards. But quite remarkably, the tank column had not come to liberate us. They did not stop. They had just by chance chosen the same road to travel on as we were marching, and by passing us close by had scared our guards into running away. But they kept on rolling. They had a destination to reach. We were now unguarded, and the jubilation was unspeakable. We were now free, no guards. But when the tank column did not stop, the jubilation ceased. We began to fear that the Nazi guards might return, and this might just have been a dream on our part. But not many minutes later, truckloads of British soldiers appeared. They stopped and they called up truckloads filled with food and began handing it out to us. And we realized that, remarkably, our ordeal, endless ordeal, had certainly now ended. Well, there was a second round of jubilation, but people were really at the end of their strength. After a lengthy spell in hospital, followed by convalescence, we finally received permission to be reunited with my father in the UK. With the help of a welfare officer, they had located my father. He applied for permission for my late mother and I to join him in the UK. It took time, but eventually we were reunited, a bittersweet reunion because my little brother was no longer with us. I was incredibly lucky to have parents alive. Of the many survivors I got to know, practically none had even one parent alive. Almost without exception, they were all orphans. I learned English quite fast. My father, who had volunteered to serve in the British Army, was quite literally a pauper. And I mention it because my parents lived an extremely frugally life. And nevertheless, they felt that they had to give me, a now 16-year-old boy, who had not had any education for 7 years. The school I began attending as a little boy was closed down before I was 9 years old. I began at 6, so I had less than 3 years education. When all Jewish children were expelled from schools. In the camps, of course, there was no education, so I, as I said, arrived as a 16-year-old, educationally, an 8 or 9-year-old one. And I was too old. I'd passed school leaving age, so it had to be done privately. My parents really deprived themselves of many necessities to pay for several terms attending an English private school. Eventually, after years of taking dead-end jobs and working in the evening on my education, I was accepted to study at university, and I received a London University degree in electronics. I married, we had children. Incidentally, I can't resist telling you that I married a girl in a million. We had 4 children, we now have numerous grandchildren, and I was always grateful, I am grateful and will remain grateful for the rest of my life for the privilege of being permitted to live my life in complete freedom in this wonderful country. I know that there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism, but at that time, as I integrated into the British way of life, people were so kind and helpful that I felt I never again would experience the plague of anti-Semitism. Every politician went around shouting the phrase, I think Lord Pickles, I'm not sure whether you used it or one of the other speakers, never again. It still rings in my ears. Politicians were proud to say as loudly as possible, never again, we'll make sure it never again happens. Well, the anti-Semites may be a small minority, but the anonymity and immediacy of the social websites has conferred a propaganda power on them which the Nazis could only dream of. And I feel that unless a courageous politician or government imposes effective controls on these websites, maybe something similar to the way newspapers are held responsible for what is published on them. Unless that happens, I feel that the future looks bleak. In closing, in finishing my talk, if I may be so bold, I would urge you to inscribe into your hearts the following message. Never remain silent when witnessing injustice. Please remember that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to remain silent. Please engrave it into your hearts and act on it without fail. Thank you so much for listening.